there's our objectives for those of you that are needing your CEs. And we're just going to start with that simple question, what is grief? And there's lots of information on these slides. Y'all know that I don't read slides to you. I'm going to point out a few things that I think it's important for us to see. But grief is simply, the simple definition of it, it is the loss of something or of someone. It can show up like a dull ache that just doesn't seem to go away. It can be unexpected and it can actually start to take over. We do generally associate grief with death, but grief is associated with any type of loss. So anything that you have loved, you can have grief over as you lose it, or maybe you didn't lose it, but it changed. The relationship changed. The job changed. The house changed. Retirement. We think that's going to be a great time, but that's one of the most, we have more instances of depression after retirement because now what am I supposed to do? And we grieve the loss of who we were. And we're going to go through other types of grief. And again, as you're looking at it, I want you to think about yourself, think about your clients, your patients, your those that you work with. Grief comes whenever we realize a loss. And grief also is a perception because my grief might look very different from someone else's grief. There is grief over realizing I'm not going to have children. There is grief over realizing I'm not going to marry. There is grief over loss of what could have been. We talked a lot about that in the support group yesterday. I'm grieving the loss of what could have been, and we're going to put names on those types of grief. There's collective grief where we're grieving together as a big group. And all of us right now, especially if you work in healthcare, you may be getting ready to take a gasp. If I just say the date, March of 2020. We remember where we were when we got the call to shut it down. If you work in a nursing home, if you work in an assisted living, if you work in memory care, we got the calls that we had to shut down, no families in. It was something we never experienced before. And there was a lot of grief related to the pandemic. And we're going to talk about some other collective griefs that we've had as a nation over the years. You can be thinking about that. So as you see, I'd be much more worried about you as a therapist, and I'm a certified grief therapist as well, if you didn't grieve than if you do grieve. Keep in mind also, and I've put a couple of things in dark print on this slide because I wanted them to stand out. A lot of these slides are busy because there's so much to cover. I wanted to make sure you have it when you get a copy of these slides. Make sure you hear this. There is no grief timetable. You may feel better in a few weeks, but it typically takes years for a person to work through grief. And you're going to hear me throughout the course of this program use the words working through grief. There is grief work. That's why our grief support group meets once a month and it's 90 minutes because we actually do grief work. It's a very different type of support group. Grief counseling looks a little bit different than regular counseling. If we don't work through grief, we can get stuck in grief. What most of us want to do, though, with grief is go over, under, or around it. We don't want to go through it because it hurts. It's not pleasant. But then we find people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s who still seem to be hung or caught in their teens or even in childhood or their early 20s because they never worked through the grief of something that happened to them at that time. And emotionally, It's like they stunted right there. And they live day to day with bitter and madness rather than choosing to do the hard work, walking through grief, which would make that so much better. And I want you to hear this quote. There is no end to grief. The goal is to adapt to the loss and incorporate grief into our life experience such that grief becomes integrated. And we'll talk about what that can look like so that it becomes a positive experience. It's called meaning. We'll talk about Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was one of the first that really talked about grief in this country. And she had her 5 stages, and she ended up going back with work with David Kessler, and she added meaning to grief. We'll talk about that. So let's look at some of the symptoms of grief. It's kind of like whenever we're doing dementia education and we ask a room full of people, tell me everything you know about dementia, and they say memory loss, and then they say nothing else. And we know that there's about 36 common symptoms to dementia. Well, what about depression? Again, when we teach about depression, tell me everything you know about depression. Most everybody will say, well, they're sad. Well, there's people that are depressed that don't look sad because there's over 20 symptoms to depression. So, what does grief look like? These are the most common symptoms that you see here. It can be excruciating, it can feel like it is never ending. Anger is very common and very normal. Confusion, difficulty returning to a normal routine can also happen. Brain fog can happen to us when we're in grief. And one of the things I want you to keep in mind if you have a loved one with dementia, we are in grief from before the diagnosis. We just don't usually use that word because, again, we associate grief with death when grief actually has to do with loss. And when we first start thinking it might be dementia, loss starts happening because we start thinking of the loss of the future. We're going to talk about that. The loss of the present. So, what grief is? It is our body's way and our mind's way of trying to adjust to a life without the person or without the thing or without the job because we're trying to adjust to the full impact of the loss. It's us trying to accept that new reality and to build meaning into our lives. Usually, there's a sense of disbelief that comes early. Sometimes this is called denial. Immediately, when something bad happens or something that we consider a stressor happens, it is not uncommon to go, that didn't happen. That couldn't have just happened. I can't believe that happened. In the blink of an eye, just like that, my life changed. Whether it was a diagnosis, a divorce, a death, a bankruptcy, all kinds of things that bring grief. We're going to define a few words here. So let's look at that word mourning. Mourning is actually an external expression of our thoughts and feelings after a loss. One of my support group members one time said that he knew he had switched to mourning after his wife died because he'd been going through grief for years. And keep in mind also with dementia, it's not days, weeks, or months, it's years that we're doing this because he said, and we live in the South. For those of you that aren't in the South, maybe you don't do this, but in the South, when somebody dies, what do? We show up with chicken. We show up with a casserole. We show up with food because we're taking care of the family. Maybe we send flowers. Maybe we make a donation to a fund that they wanted us to donate to. But we show up with something. We give. It's an external expression. People tend to wear black. We have that funeral or that celebration of life. That is mourning. It's an external expression. So let's look at sadness. What is sadness? The word sad, that's a really generic word, and we're going to look at a feelings wheel later that will help you on your journey and help your clients if you are a professional. It's a feeling of sorrow, it's a feeling of being unhappy, but I want you to look at this range of sadness. It can go anywhere from just a little disappointment. I'm sad because they took my favorite show off the air. So I'm disappointed is the better word. All the way up to extreme despair. In the grief group this past Saturday, we were working through words that describe what we're feeling after the loss of our loved one. And one of the women came up with this word to describe her sadness. I'm crushed. Crushed is such a heavier word than sad. Because I can be sad because my show's not on. But crushed, something really happened. And what it's doing is it's serving as a reminder that we need help or that we need comfort. So, what about that word loss? Think about some other things that we lose, maybe even some things in your life that you've lost. If we've been through a divorce, that's most definitely a loss. Nobody goes into a marriage and says, well, we're just going to do this till the fun stops and then we'll do. So, divorce is a loss. Losing a house. Maybe it's because we couldn't pay for it, but maybe it's because we downsized. We moved, but I lived in that house 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. And we grieve the loss of a home. A business, we can lose a business. Let's throw in there a pet. Pet loss is very real. A bankruptcy, a repossession. And what about this, as we all can go back to March of 2020? The loss of our day-to-day normal. Because even if you didn't work in healthcare, everyone in the United States and around the world was affected. We saw a lot of anger, and we'll talk about why that was. Anger is easier to process than fear. Anger is easier to show than fear. But at the root of anger is fear. We were all scared to death because we lost our normal overnight. We lost our normal. So now let's look at that word bereavement. Bereavement. This is the experience of the loss. I'm going to say again, there is no timeline for bereavement or for grief. The only time we start getting really, really concerned about a time, and I hate to even use that word time, is that if we get to 6 months after the loss, whatever the loss is, and it is still devastating to the point that we are not functioning in our day-to-day life, we most definitely need professional help because now it has turned to something that's called complicated grief. Usually in the first 6 months after a loss, it is where we're learning to adjust, we're living with the loss, we're realizing that it really did happen, and we're realizing that it's permanent. Another thing that happens, and those of you who are professionals and work in healthcare, we need to acknowledge and realize that we have grief over the loss of our patients, clients, and residents. I work in a field where there could be a week where I sit with 3 people in a week as they die, or I sit with 2 people or 1 people, or I may go weeks and not sit with anyone. But over the course of my career, I've sat with over 500 people who've died. That's grief. That's heavy. There's a name for that type of grief. We're going to look at that. One of the things that we need to consider whenever we're looking at grief and why we react or respond differently to different types of loss is the relationship we had with the person. We talked about this yesterday in our support group. The way I respond to the loss of a great grandparent that maybe I didn't know very well is going to be very different from the loss of a mother that I knew very well that raised me in the house. It's the degree of attachment. There's the key word. The degree of attachment has a lot to do with how we grieve. Same thing with our house, our job, our marriage, whatever it is that we are grieving, the degree of attachment comes into play. Now let's look at what is depression. Depression is very common, but it is a serious, notice I've got on here, medical illness. Those of us who work in the field, we are really moving away from using the term mental illness because there's a stigma to mental illness. Depression is a medical illness. And what if we also called it brain health? People tell me about their heart issues all day long. They'll tell me about their stomach issues. They'll tell me about all kinds of issues. But we start talking about something going on with the brain, and there's such a stigma. Let's just call it brain health. Part of depression can be severe despondency, hopelessness, and dejection. It can happen at any age, but we often see it in adults. There's over 20 common symptoms to depression, and here are the majority of them. Depression affects different people in different ways. I would encourage you, when you get a copy of these slides, to take a highlighter, to be really, really honest with yourself. Nobody's going to be looking at this. And today is, what, the 15th of the month? So we're 2 weeks into the new year. I would go down this list and highlight any of these that I've had since the first of the year. Because we can get pretty good about thinking we are, here comes the big F word, fine. Professionals and family caregivers. I'm fine. Doing the same thing I've always been doing. I'm expecting different results, but I'm doing the same thing I've always been doing. And we're not fine. So again, a good exercise. Take this slide. When you get it, you'll get it noon. Take a highlighter. Be very honest and look back at the last 2 weeks. Highlight any of those that you might be having yourself. And the thing about depression is that 100% of the time we can treat it. We're not going to cure it 100% of the time because there is treatment-resistant depression. But even in treatment-resistant depression, which is rare, we can alleviate some symptoms. About 80% of the time, depression can be completely cured. And it is not always just with an antidepressant. That might be part of it, and it's okay. It's temporary. If you are taking care of someone with dementia, there's actually a name for this type of depression. It's called situational depression. If you're in the middle of going through a divorce, it's situational depression. Whatever it is you're in the middle of, if it is something that isn't normally there, that is situational depression. And the earlier we start to treat it, the more effective it will be. Exercise is one of the best things we can do for depression, but when we're depressed, what's the last thing we want to do? Exercise. And it's really, really good for us. Keep in mind, though, that there is no one size fits all with treatment. And that's where, when you start into talk therapy, when you start seeing a therapist or a counselor, you want to make sure that, and therapists know that there's not a cookie cutter. We're not going to go in with all of our clients and do the exact same thing. Now let's look at some of this about adjustment. I talked about attachment, how attached we were to the person or the thing or the situation has to do with how we grieve. But let's look at adjusting. Some of the feelings that come with that adjustment, making plans without them, that starts before the death. In the case of dementia, families have to go through a time, usually in about that mid stage, where they start looking ahead without the loved one, even if it's something like I'm going to take a trip to my grandchild's graduation and he can't go, but I am. I'm making a plan without them. It's interesting. You also see on there making sense of this and then moving forward. You will never hear me use move on. Moving on sounds like we're leaving something behind. We're not doing that. We're moving forward. There was a support group member one time whose husband had passed away, and they had been avid cyclists. They had very expensive bicycles, and then her husband had learned and taught himself to make things to put on their bicycles. And there was his bicycle, and there was her bicycle that they had used for years. And she wanted to get back to cycling. So she did something that was really healthy. She took both of their bikes and traded them in on a new bike for her, but she took off some of the gadgets and things from her husband's bike and put them onto her new bike. And here's the sentence she said when she came onto group and was telling us about it. I'm carrying a part of him into my future. Carrying a part of him into my future. Just by thinking through what's a way that I can do this that would be healthy for me. And that was a healthy exercise for her. Here's some of our basic grief needs. They're not going to go away. We cannot stuff grief. Well, people do stuff grief, but we see what happens. We need to know there's people that can help. You're not the only one going through it. Grief does become more manageable with time. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but distance between the event, it makes it more manageable. That's the easiest way to put it. You can most definitely stay connected to your loved one and carry them into your future, even after they've passed. There's a wide range of thoughts, emotions, and experiences that come along with grief that are normal. We're going to look at a feelings wheel in just a minute, and it is not divided into normal, not normal, good, bad. It's just a feelings wheel. Your feelings are your feelings. There are not good feelings and bad feelings. So let's get into some of these types of grief. We're going to go fairly quickly through these because there's a lot of them. I want to try to get to as much as I can, but you're still going to get this full slideshow because there's a lot of information. Let's look at the one called abbreviated grief. This is common after an extended illness like dementia. And it's also common whenever it was an insignificant attachment. So again, great grandparent or great great grandparent that I wasn't that close to. I have some grief, but it's an abbreviated grief. Children may have abbreviated grief because you may be looking at them and going, children seem to just get over it quicker than adults. Emotional attachment isn't the same. We don't have the feelings. We might attempt to numb the feelings. We may use drugs, alcohol, food, work, anything to make pain go away. Those things, by the way, can lead to addiction, depression, and anxiety. But an example of abbreviated grief would be the loss of a distant relative. Well, what about absent grief? Absent grief. An example, a parent puts aside their own grief to help their children get through a loss. Somebody who refuses to talk about the loss. It just appears that it's absent. Refusing to acknowledge the loss. Becoming overly involved in other projects so I don't have to think about the loss. And again, numbing feelings with drugs, alcohol, food, etc. They probably are showing their grief in a more subtle way because they could be experiencing turmoil, but they're showing it in a different way. Maybe all of a sudden, after 16 years of not smoking, they pick up cigarettes again. There's their grief showing up. Mm. So just because someone doesn't appear to be grieving, it does not mean that they are not grieving. I've heard too many people say, well, they aren't even grieving the lot. And here we are being judgmental about the way someone else is grieving. We don't know what's going on with them. We don't have any idea how they're grieving. Everyone is different. Now, the next two are the two we see the most when we talk about dementia. And I want you to see this little sign over here on the right. There is nothing more difficult than grieving the loss of a loved one who is still alive. So, ambiguous grief, sometimes it's called ambiguous loss, is where we grieve the loss of the living. We grieve the loss of the living. This term actually came about because of MIAs in war, missing in action. So families would get notified back during Vietnam that their loved one was missing in action. Well, what does that mean? Are they alive? Are they captured? Are they dead? I don't know. It's an ambiguous grief. I can't go into conventional grief because you didn't just tell me they were dead. I can't go into, so ambiguous grief is grieving the loss of the living. This is why we see this with dementia. They are right in front of us, slipping away a little bit at a time. Other ambiguous grief, a kidnapping, the foster care system, addiction, natural disasters, suicides can bring ambiguous grief. The death of an infant or a miscarriage can bring ambiguous grief. Mental health issues, a divorce. Because think about a mental health issue. We have a loved one in our family who has a mental health issue that's severe, and maybe it has caused some shame or embarrassment in the family, and I'm grieving that. It has a name. It's ambiguous grief. And then there's anticipatory grief. This is grieving a loss before it happens. When we have a loved one that has dementia, we know that dementia is terminal. We know that not only are we going to eventually grieve their death, but we're going to grieve all these losses along the way. Because if you've educated yourself, you've come to programs like this, you've gone to our YouTube and you've watched our videos, you're on support group and you are learning, there's that anticipatory grief of what's going to happen next. I always like calling this, it's grieving the loss of it's grieving an unknown future. Grieving an unknown future. Now, there are some things that can be good about anticipatory grief. We get a chance to do some letting go. We get a chance to do some forgiveness. There are benefits to this. We get a chance to have some conversations, maybe do some legacy work, make some plans, spend some quality time together. Examples of anticipatory grief, someone who's terminally ill, an anticipated layoff, a pending divorce where you know it's coming. We're grieving the loss of something in the future. Now, I want to start to relate that to the reality of dementia right here, just real quick. A person with dementia is both here and gone at the same time. If you're a family member, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And we never know from day to day, hour to hour, who we're going to have. Also, we're not only taking care of them, we're taking care of me too, or trying to. So I'm a caregiver, but I'm also a person with needs. And I wish this was over, but I also wish they'd keep living. And then I have this guilt from wishing it was over. But I wish they would keep living. But usually, the more we talk, I wish they'd keep living the way they were. It's called magical thinking. I want to turn back time, and that's not reality. I'm sad about my losses of my future, but maybe I'm also having some happiness, and I find myself in a support group laughing. Grief. Call it what it is. In counseling, we say if you can name it, you can tame it. If you can feel it, you can heal it. But you got to be able to use these words. A person who is terminally ill goes through something called anticipatory grief as well. People who are dying experience anticipatory grief. Now, I want you to think about this in a person who's dying, whether they have dementia or not. This is especially more prevalent in people who don't have dementia. Let's say they have ALS. Let's say they have kidney failure. Let's say they have cancer. We, the family member, are losing one person. They, the patient, are losing all of their relationships, not just one. So they grieve as well. It can be overwhelming. And many times we'll see someone in anticipatory grief really withdraw into themselves. They may even sit and look at walls because they're just coming into themselves. One of the best things that we can say to somebody who is having anticipatory grief about death is something like, we'll miss each other, won't we? We'll miss each other. We're normalizing it. We're making it okay to talk about it. I had a resident walk in my office about 3 weeks before she died, which is unusual. Sit down, look at me, and say, called me by name. Holly, do you have any regrets in your life? She was doing something called a life review. It's very common in people as they approach end of life. She wasn't asking about my regrets, and I knew that. So I said, I think I do have regrets. I think we all do. Why don't you tell me about yours? And that woman sat down and she told me her biggest regret in her life. And I got to share in that, and it was precious. It was very, very sad, but it was precious. And I'm going to share with you what hers was. Her husband had died when she was in her mid-50s. He just died in the bed, massive heart attack. She was in her mid-50s. Several years later, she met another man. She was in her late 50s and fell in love with him and wanted to get married. And her adult children told her she was too old to get married. And she didn't do it. And now she was in her 90s, 3 weeks before she died, and that was the one thing she was looking back on her life and regretting, was not marrying that second man. And I got to hear the story, and I got to talk through that with her. So it's common for someone to go through what's called a life review. I want to give you some resources as we go. This is a wonderful book for children. It's called The Memory Box, a book about grief by Joanna Rowland. I do not only use this with children, I also use it with adults. I use it with teenagers. I used it with my own daughter after the death of my granddad, her great granddad, who she was close to. And we made a memory box. I still have it. I found it not too long ago. I encourage you to get that book. If you work with people that are going through grief, therapists, social workers, I encourage you to get that book. And if you've got children, grandchildren that are going through grief, fantastic book. Now let's go back to that collective grief that I mentioned earlier. Collective grief is when we're going through grief together as a group. Now, some of you are old enough that if I said this date, you're going to know exactly what happened and probably where you were. November of 1963. November of 1963. And if we were in the room together, some of you would have just said out loud, JFK assassination, because it rocked the world. The assassination of a president. A little, a little more, many of us on here, 9/11. There's another date. It stopped us in our tracks. And we collectively, as a nation, grieved it. We watched it over and over and over. The death of a celebrity, Princess Diana. John Lennon was assassinated. Collective grief. Many of you, if you're from Louisiana or from Texas, I just say the name Katrina or Harvey, and we had collective grief going on. The Challenger disaster. Many of us were the age where we were sitting in a classroom watching it. Collective grief. Pandemic. What helps with this? When we publicly mourn together, we start to heal together as well. So community action helps. Giving ourselves time privately helps as well. But that is a type of grief. It's called collective grief. Now, this particular one I've already touched on a little bit and it has several names. Complicated grief is the name we use the most often. Chronic grief, exaggerated grief, or prolonged grief disorder. This is when we're 6 months past the event, the death, the job loss, the divorce, and the grief still interferes every day with life and the ability to function. We normally see extreme longing for whatever was lost, detachment, getting in the bed, having rage, being avoidant, maybe developing some irrational fears. Some examples of this is a parent who's lost a child. It's pretty common. A tragic death that we did not see coming at all, a suicide. But we can also have complicated grief after a dependent relationship ends. So after a divorce. We can see complicated grief after a natural disaster, a tornado, a hurricane, a traumatic death. We can also see it when there's multiple losses back to back to back or concurrent stressors. There's strong emotions that are tied to this. The feelings don't come and go and they don't lessen in intensity at 6 months post trauma. That's when we're looking at complicated. And then we've got something that most people know as normal grief. This is the grief we've had after a death, right after something happens, but most commonly after a death. It can be right after a job loss. It can be right after a divorce. It can be right after the loss of a home, but it's called conventional grief or normal grief. This is that normal, natural, necessary, the one that we have to work through. It's very individualistic and it's unique. It's going to look different for people. Some people start to eat a lot. Some people don't eat at all. Some people get in the bed. Some people sit up and stare at the wall or stare at the TV. Some people cry. Some people don't have tears for the longest. Some people overreact. Others respond. Some people have a lot of guilt. Very unique. It also has physical symptoms. We'll look at some of those. Heart palpitations, high blood pressure, dreams of the loss. Another one we're going to look at is cumulative grief or grief overload. How we get this is when there's two losses close together. Let's say the loss of a job, and right behind that, we have a divorce. Or the loss of a loved one, and right behind that, we lose our pet. We have an empty nest. That last child just left, and right behind that, we have a death. This is actually a type of complicated grief, but it does have a name, cumulative grief. Many times it can lead to PTSD, which we're starting to call PTS now, post-traumatic syndrome, substance abuse, major depressive disorder. So let's look at some examples. An accident where several family members were lost, an unexpected death of a friend followed by the death of a family member, losses during the pandemic. Maybe we lost some coworkers, then our husband lost their job, or the loss of multiple pets in a short time. There's a grief called delayed grief, and that's when there's a significant period of time between the loss and the reaction to it. You know, when we usually see these is whenever it's something when we feel like we need revenge. So it is common after there's been a homicide because we can get so caught up in we've got to catch that person, we've got to get them prosecuted, we've got to, and by the time that gets done, let's say the person is caught, they're prosecuted, they're sent to prison, and the family many times will then go, it still didn't bring my loved one back. But they've put all their power and their energy into the prosecution so that I didn't have to sit in the grief. Has lots of physical symptoms with delayed grief. We see this a lot after a natural disaster. We also see this a lot after something like, and those of you who are in Texas, you're going to know this immediately, even though it was worldwide, Uvalde, that school shooting that happened. We came to a standstill, and it has been kind of rubbed raw this week because now we're having a trial and the stories are all coming out again. And people can have delayed grief because of shock. Delayed grief because we have an adult child left to care for a surviving parent. Let's say one parent has passed from dementia and now the other parent is ill. So I don't even start to take care of myself because I've got to take care of this other parent now. There's disenfranchised grief. This is when we are mourning a loss that's not acknowledged by others. So one of the pictures I have on here is someone who won a gold medal, but she won it in the 2020 Olympics. Y'all remember the 2020 Olympics? There's nobody in the stands. My family's not here. I'm so excited. I've worked my whole life for this. There's nobody here to help me celebrate. So it's considered disenfranchised. It's what we perceive as a loss. Because we may look at that young woman and go, but you got a gold medal. But she looks at it and sees, there's nobody here. This wasn't my expectations. Other forms of disenfranchised grief, and it is sometimes we get rejected because of our grief. We mourn the loss. Let's say our ex-spouse dies, and we have grief over that. And family might be going, well, you divorced him 30 years ago. Right, but at one time I loved that person, or it's the father of my child. It's a very real grief. Miscarriage falls under disenfranchised grief because so many times people will say to us, you can always have another child. Everybody has a miscarriage. It's the type of grief that sometimes isn't recognized as grief. An abortion falls in this. Is it something I chose? Yes. But I'm still grieving it? Yes. Chronic illness falls in this. The loss of mobility. Well, now I'm in a wheelchair. And people may say, but you're alive. Right. But I'm in a wheelchair. And I'm grieving. And it has a name. It's called disenfranchised grief. There's also distorted grief. This is when we have an extreme emotional reaction and even behavioral changes, usually following a loss of a tragic and an unforeseen circumstance. This may be something like a death caused by a medical error. The person went in for just a regular, something they do every day, let's say a knee replacement, and they die. And it was because of a medical error. Or here's another distorted grief. I sent my child to school and they didn't come home. This is where sometimes the person can even become obsessed with the loss and they can go through extreme extreme. This is a form of complicated grief also. It can be, there's lots of magical thinking that comes with distorted grief about believing we can change the outcome when the outcome has already happened. So there's a name for that as well. There's inhibited grief. Inhibited grief shows up as aches and pains in our body, as headaches, as stomach aches. It shows up when a person tries to keep their emotions hidden. Let's say we're grieving the loss of a suicide, mourning a spouse's affair. I'm trying to stay strong for everybody else. I don't want to fall apart, not accepting the reality of what's happened. And then I start to physically react. I am watching the time, so I'm going to start going faster because we got 10 minutes. I want you to hear this because this is called masked grief, and I found this poem. It was written in memory of a son. The mask I wear is heavy, yet it doesn't weigh an ounce. The mask I wear is stifling, yet it doesn't block my face. The mask I wear is tight, yet it doesn't cling at all. The mask I wear is a disguise, yet it looks like my regular face. The mask I wear is invisible, yet it hides my feelings. The mask I wear is suffocating, yet I breathe just fine. The mask I wear is removable, yet it never comes off. The mask I wear is normalcy, yet I am grieving. This is a form of complicated grief. This is a parent who develops an illness after the death of a child. This is a sibling who starts showing symptoms of the cause of death of their brother or sister. Mask grief. There's also something called secondary loss. These are smaller losses related to the traumatic loss. So let's say there's the loss, in this case, we're going to call it the death. And then our secondary losses are loss of income, loss of identity, loss of hopes, loss of dreams, loss of faith, loss of relationships, loss of financial security, loss of support. So there's that secondary loss. It's important to recognize secondary losses. There's traumatic grief. This PTSD is much more likely with a traumatic grief. Some of the ways that this shows up is nightmares, difficulty sleeping, flashbacks, emotional numbness. We see this most often after the loss of a child, after a violent death, and we saw a lot of it after 9/11. One more, uninhibited grief. Uninhibited grief. Look what this says. When we are traumatized, we are blind. Where we have resolved our traumas, we can see. This is where we may just keep really, really busy so that we don't have to deal with this. It's a way to try to remain in control in an uncontrollable situation because trauma triggers trauma. It's very similar with absent grief. Healthcare professionals and grief. We don't want to transfer our feelings and our emotions from something else onto our families or our residents. So many times, healthcare professionals hide their grief or it comes out in a bad habit. Healthcare professionals are pretty bad about turning to things like alcohol, eating, sodas, drinking, prescriptions, shopping, ways to deal with crisis, but our clients, our residents never see it. Healthcare professionals are really, really good at doing this. What are some things that we can do to help family caregivers? What do they want when they're grieving? Families want to honor their loved ones' wishes. They want to be included in decision making. They need support from teams. They need honesty and transparency. If you're a social worker, if you are a counselor, if you are a nurse, we've got to be open and honest with these families and with the residents. Be listened to. They want to be remembered and they want to know they did everything that they could. This is validation therapy. Resources for families. Connect families with support groups of other. That's why I started by telling you about our support groups. Refer them to a social worker that does counseling. Refer them to a chaplain. Refer them to a counselor. Find online support for grief. There are so many different things out there. There are books. bibliotherapy. One of the best I've got. Oh, you're not gonna be able to see it. There it is. First Aid for Broken Hearts. This is my go-to book, First Aid for Broken Hearts. And then if their loved one went through hospice, use that hospice bereavement support. Here's another fantastic book for children. It's called A Kid's Book About Death. I can't tell you how many adults have told me that this book helped them too. A Kid's Book About Death. Look that up. How does grief affect the body? This is another one I'm going to encourage you. Take that highlighter, go through this list, and let's go back to January 1st, the last 2 weeks. When the stress of grief is chronic, we will react physically to it, and then it contributes to medical conditions. Grief also comes in waves. It comes in emotional waves, and those emotional waves oscillate. It's normal, it's expected. I'm much more worried about you if these things don't happen. There are going to be times when you are standing there and it feels like everything's fine. You're standing in that water that's not even moving, it's like glass. You're going to be standing there at other times and you've got to really plant your feet because the waves are starting to come, but you're still upright. And then there's going to be a grief burst where you're going to get knocked down and you're barely keeping your nose above water. There's a name, it's called a grief burst. It's almost always sensory, something we see, smell, taste, hear, or touch. What does grief then do to the brain? It makes it where we have a hard time focusing. We call it grief brain. It's brain fog. We have a hard time managing our stress. We are lethargic. We have memory issues. It can lead to sadness and loneliness. Here's that feelings chart that I mentioned earlier. You see there, you can take sad and then you go out from there and you find a word that's a stronger, more powerful word. Because I said earlier, if we can name it, we can tame it. Most of us were not taught emotional hygiene. Most of us have no formal training on how to deal with loss. We learned emotional hygiene by watching parents or other adults around us, and how many of us were watching dysfunctional parents. And so we picked up those bad habits, or we watched them stuff, or we watched them drink. And so we picked up on that. Give yourself permission to grieve. Keep in mind, children learn how to deal with loss by watching those around them. Here's a good list of things right here. Right there at the top, I've got counseling, support groups, time, tap into positive emotions, being patient with yourself. And again, you're getting these slides because I know I'm starting to go fast because we're running out of time. Grieving, though, is moving forward through feelings. Look at this. There are two types of pain in the world: pain that simply hurts you and pain that inspires you to grow. So, what we want to do is move forward, acknowledge your grief. The only way to move forward is to feel the hard feelings. You feel it, you can heal it. Replace the need to understand with a commitment to move forward. Tears and grieving gives us permission. It shows other people that we're expressing our grief. It is not something to hide. It humanizes unthinkable tragedy. Public displays of emotion are something that's very, very normal. If you break down in the grocery store because you see something you don't need to buy anymore because that person isn't there anymore, give yourself some grace. Again, continue to use that word moving forward. Find ways of marking the transition, celebrating traditions. This is a list of 40 different things that you can do to distract yourself at home. You are getting these. There's the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. Here's a real grief cycle right there. Kubler-Ross is right. We do have all of these: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning, but it looks more like that, that's for sure. We've added on here another grief cycle where we talk about the shock, denial, the anger, when to seek professional help. If you find yourself catastrophizing, believing that there's still more to come, ruminating, going over and over and over and over with the if onlys or the woulda, coulda, shouldas, disrupting healthy eating, exercise, or sleep, physical pain. Even though it's painful, it is normal. I put on here Grief Share. Grief Share is a faith-based, and it's always at a church. So it is for after loss. You can check out Grief Share online. How to support others, be present. That's the number one thing you can do is be present for someone. Don't advise them and don't judge them, but just listen. And please don't ever say to somebody who's grieving, I know exactly how you feel. You don't know exactly how they feel. Finally, in summary, I said earlier, I know I've now been with over 500 people as they've passed. And it can really be a blessing to go on the journey. If you are a professional, going on this journey with families is a blessing if you choose to look at it that way. You will never forget the sacred time you spend with someone as they transition from this life to the next. So I'm going to encourage you to embrace grief and to not run away from grief and help others through it, and it'll help you as well. There's our resources. I also encourage you to become better and not bitter. There's my information. And again, we went right up to time. There was a lot of information here. If you do have, let me stop sharing. If you do have questions, if you've got comments, let me look in the chat real quick. Yes, you are going to get a link to the slides. Be looking for an email this afternoon from Jamie. You'll get the slides. You'll get this presentation. And before the end of the week, this presentation will be on our YouTube page. Please share it. And thank you so much for your kind comments. She will send our latest education calendar as well. Bye, everybody. Have a great afternoon.